about our country, you might even say it's a two-edged sword, is the number of overseas-based Guyanese willing to offer solutions to the country's problems. On Blade Talk this evening, we'll be meeting one of these very prominent contributors to the discussions on topical issues in Guyana. Our guest this evening on Plain Talk is Dr. David Hinds, an executive member of the Working People's Alliance, a member of the board of the Walter Rodney Institute of Social Action. Dr. Hinds, welcome again.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you.
It's been close to 17 months since you've been out of Guyana. Can you tell us why you've stayed away that long?
Well, partly is that I was quite unhappy with what was happening in the country in terms of the violence that was taking place, and I couldn't quite work out what was going on. And one of the things that I learned is that if you don't understand something, take time to understand and don't get in the mix of things. I'm one of those persons who like to comment on issues of the day, and I didn't quite understand what was going on, and it was that was the main reason that I stayed away.
But you still were commenting fairly often.
Yes.
Particularly on the issue of box and the African Guyanese relationships with Indo-Guyanese and so on.
Well, I was really going on what I know of Buxton, having been born there, and I grew up there, spent most of my life there. I know something about Buxton, and so even from a distance, I could speak to a certain extent in Buxton. But there's a handicap when you live away from Guyana. Things are happening here so quickly that when you're away for 3-4 months, I mean, it's like you're away for a year, 2 years, because things are moving so fast. And it's very easy to lose touch with everything. You depend a lot on the media, but in the mix of things, the media sometimes become notorious for what they don't say rather than what they say. And so at a certain level, one cannot depend solely on the media. And then you depend on talking to people here and talking to people when they come overseas and so forth. But there's so many versions of what's going on in the country that it's really difficult to form an opinion.
Of course, your experience having been here just about 3 weeks is that even when you're here, you still hear so many different versions and variations of the same story.
Exactly. And that's a big problem, even when you live here, as you quite rightly say. It's a very big problem in trying to understand what is going on, trying to formulate some kind of view of the overall situation. And that has been my problem to some extent.
You're, of course, one of many very prominent Bostonians, very conscious Bostonians. Another, of course, is a village elder, Brother David. You're in contact with him?
Yes, I'm in constant contact with him.
And what's his position? Does he share this view about being away and therefore not being sufficiently capable of speaking on the issues?
Well, when you've been in politics for 60 years, as Brother UC has been, you develop a grasp of the motion of the country, that even when you're away, you tend to draw on that reservoir. And I think you see, although being away draws on that, and in that sense he's vastly, his situation is vastly different from mine, because he's able to call on all of that experience and understanding of the political motion of the country. But I think UC has been somewhat disappointed, and that's putting it mildly, about what has taken place in Boston. I don't want to speak for him, but he has said enough publicly.
Well, what about you? What about you and your views on Boston? It became the center of some people call it freedom fighters, others call it bandits, criminals, and people from Boston were going into adjacent Indo-Guyanese areas and so on, and creating havoc and creating fear.
Yeah, you know, some people tell me that I'm very biased when it comes to Boston. I take what has happened in Boston very personally, and I suppose one should not when you're dealing with public issues and so on. But I can't help. Bostonians will tell you that there's something special about being a Bostonian, being born there and so on. And whether it's a myth or not is something that helps to define the Boston character, and we all carry it around. And so when the events began to unfold in Boston, I thought it was a personal duty of mine to begin to say some things. And in the early days, when 2002, during the July-August period, I was here and I made some comments in Boston. And the short
That's July-August of 2002.
Yes, and I made my position very clear, jointly with Brother UC and Sister Ndai. We put out a couple of statements saying very clearly we could not agree with a project ostensibly to liberate African people, but that it's targeting ordinary Indian people and in turn targeting African people. And we sounded, if you will, a warning, basically saying that this problem of violence could escalate. And I dare say that we were correct in predicting that violence could only breed more violence, especially in the context of our politics. But I remain very, very disappointed about what has happened in Boston. I don't know all the ins and outs and all the various twists and turns about what happened there and in relation to the larger country. What I do know is that Boston is destroyed as a village in terms of the level of violence that still exists in that place, the level of uncivility, that what took place in Boston has left in its wake a very nasty taste.
So in the foreseeable future, there's a permanent scar, you're saying?
Yes, and that's my concern. That's my concern. Like I said, the project that was there, I don't know very much about that project, and I can't speak to that. But what I can.
What project?
Well, I think it was a project.
What project? The activities, the criminal activities?
The criminal activities. I don't believe that they were simply criminal activities. I do believe that it was part of something that was larger. I can't necessarily put my fingers on it. You hear all kinds of stories, and you don't know which one to believe. But I think it was clear to anyone who paid attention to what was happening that there was some kind of political connection. I don't know whether it was party political, but I know there was some kind of political connection. Chris, when that situation died down, I called for a commission of inquiry to determine exactly what took place in Boston. Not a single commentator, not a single editorial, not a single political party supported my call. I understood why the African-led organizations would not have endorsed such a call. I couldn't understand why the government would not endorse such a call. And I think the revelations over the last couple of weeks, which we'll come to later on, kind of explained to me why the government did not make a call. And I was very clear that once we did not ascertain exactly what took place in Buxton, that we would not see an end to the killings. And I think we were correct.
Dr. Hinds, you're saying that and Kwan and yourself were issuing statements, writing letters to the press. Did that signal a division at the level of the leadership of the Working People's Alliance, of which you were one of the leading members?
Well, that would be a fair comment. That would be a fair comment. Because we certainly, but let me put it this way, the Working People's Alliance, I mean, like most organizations in the country, would have been confused about what was going on, and perhaps that was the reason they weren't issuing forthright statements. And so we decided to issue statements on our own. So it would be a fair comment to say there was a division at the level.
To what extent do you think those activities might have harmed the image of the Working People's Alliance?
I don't know that those activities harm the image in any fundamental way. Of course, one of our leading members, well, not one, I mean, 4 of our leading members, whether you see and I myself, Brother Takumo Gonse, we were making statements to the public, and depending on where you stand, you will see them as positive. I mean, if you stood on one side, you would have seen the Andaye Guyana Hinds statements as negative and harming the image of the WPA. And if you stood on another side, you may have seen they were going to say statements harming the image of the WPA. The problem for a kind of party like the WPA that is not rooted in one camp or the other is exactly that you're going to be seen as negative from both sides.
So you're saying that a party that started essentially and touted and wore very proudly the badge of multi-ethnicity and multiracial are now finding that something of a negative?
Well, no, I don't. I think in a broad way, we still subscribe to that thing, that multiracial vision of the country. But the WPA is part of Guyana. And what has happened since 1992, unfortunately, with the return of free and fair elections, is that the racial division and the contradictions arising out of our historical racial division have been heightened. And it has come down in the society to people really holding very strong to their racial camps. And the irony is that the WPA fought for the return of free and fair elections and for a democratic opening and democratization. But with that democratic opening has come a reopening of the racial question. And the country is sharply divided, and I think that members of the WPA, by and large, could not altogether escape that.
Do you see this as the attitude of the electorate as a positive rejection of the Working People's Alliance, or was it a consequence of the the people following the two major camps?
It is a consequence. I would think it's a consequence. The WPA's vision for the future of this country, and the WPA has always put forward a vision for the future of this country. It cannot be negated by reasonable people. I mean, in terms of our economic vision, in terms of our general vision of harmony between and among the various races, gender issues and so on, working class representation. I mean, we've been really, really, really positive. But that kind of message in the mix, in the context of sharp divisions, sharp racial divisions, that kind of message gets put on the back burner. And so I would say, yes, it's a consequence of where Guyana is at the moment.
Now, one of perhaps the less appreciated facts of 1992 is the support which the WPA gave to the PPP in Parliament, isn't it?
Yes, the WPA gave the PPP a majority. A lot of people don't realize that. The PPP needed a seat in the hinterland, Region 8, and the WPA, through merging their votes in Region 8, was able to give a majority, and the PPP was able to get that regional seat, and as a result was able to form the government on their own. And so the WPA is responsible in two ways for this government. One way, because, and I'm saying this unapologetically, that after 1974 it was the WPA that spearheaded the struggle for the return of democracy in this country. Yes, the PPP played a very important role.
Particularly in the sugar.
In the sugar.
Industrial sector.
Yes, but I'm writing a book on the period, and every major upheaval during the Burnham years, starting in 1971, except every major upheaval except the sugar strike in 1977, was initiated and led by forces other than the PPP and GAU. And so this notion that the PPP played this leading role and others were minuscule and so on.
Where does this notion come from?
The notion comes from the fact that, and it's race. It's race.
No, what I mean, who's promoting that?
The PPP. The PPP is promoting that notion. It's easy for people who don't understand the situation, who have not followed the history, to fall for that. Because if the regime was an African regime, it meant that the people who were opposed to it were Indians. You know, because the notion is that blacks would not have opposed the PNC regime, and so it was the Indians led by the PPP who opposed the regime, but that's not true. I mean, the sugar workers, the African villages on the East Coast and the West Coast played very important roles, led of course by Walter Rodney, and that's the genius of Rodney, in that Rodney was able to mobilize African opposition to the PNC, something that the PPP could not do. And so African Guyanese played a very important role in terms of helping to bring an end to the authoritarian regime and the return of free and fair elections.
During the 70s, wasn't there also very close collaboration and coordination between the bauxite and sugar unions?
Yes, the bauxite, that collaboration started in 1976 with the bauxite strike, heightened during the 77 strike. But something we don't realize and we forget, it was the Land for the Landless campaign led by ASCRE in 1973 actually was a collaboration between ASCRE and IPRA. IPRA was the Indian People's Revolutionary Associate, led by Moses Bagwan. And there again, I mean, it was the WPA because it was ASCRE, IPRA, Ratoon, and originally the Working People's...
was an intellectual grouping?
University grouping led by Clive Thomas and Joshua Ramsamy and so on up on the university campus. But it was the IPRA, ASCRE, Land for the Landless campaign in 1973 was the really first blow in the post-independence era. It was the really first blow of racial unity. And then it was picked up by the bauxite workers in 1976 and so on.
Now, having lived through those days, having seen the transformation to free and fair elections, and again you get a government that has been now in power since 1992, over 11 years. How do you think the populace as a whole responding to this concentration of power that we have?
Well, I think it's divided. I think the Indians, because they're supporters of the PPP, and whenever the PPP has been in power, Indian insecurity has lessened. And whenever the PNC is out of power, African insecurity heightens and vice versa. So the perception of the concentration of power is largely determined by which race group you belong to. Now there are Indians, of course, who are outraged by what the PNC, the PPP, is doing, how they're governing. But that is not going to be translated into opposition to the PPP. Certainly, it has not done so in 11 years. And some would argue that in the short run, it is not going to be translated. So there is a sentiment on the Indian side that prefers to turn a blind eye to what is going on. There's another sentiment that speaks out against it, but even then, would not act in any concerted way. Whereas Africans as a bloc would generally see the PP as negative. And I think that is one of the basic problems of politics in Guyana, that to the African, the PPP is evil, and to the Indian, the PNC is evil.
Now, given all your research, all your analysis, all your writing, all your agonizing perhaps, is that an intractable problem? Is it capable? Does it lend itself to a solution?
I do think it lends itself to a solution. It's not going to be easy. It has not been easy. And it will not be easy to arrive at some kind of, solution maybe stretching it.
Is it just an accommodation?
But that's where we have to begin. We have to begin with an accommodation.
Now, you're saying that once the Indians are in government, the blacks feel marginalized. Once the blacks are in government, the Indians feel marginalized. Does that lead inevitably to this principle that you've been advocating for some time, power sharing?
Well, it doesn't lead inevitably there. It ought to lead there if people are serious about saving the country. But it doesn't lead there because there is still this notion that we have not reached the brink. Some people are saying we are 1 minute to midnight, 10 minutes to midnight, and so forth. And so we don't, there's not a sense on the part of the politicians that we are well past midnight,
So you're saying have we gone over the brink? Not in physical terms, have we?
Yes, I would think so.
But surely other countries have gone much, much worse. I'm not trying to downplay the significance of our problems, but have we really gone over the brink?
Yes, when you consider the Guyana is a small country, when you consider that for 45, 50 years, that we have not really got down to serious business of economic development. We have not really got down to serious business of building a nation. What we have here is really the shell of a nation. We have a space that we call Guyana that is in total confusion. And if that is not over the brink, I don't know what is. I mean, we're barely holding together as a society. We're barely holding together as two nations in the same space.
Now, over the brink in terms of politics in the life of a country would constitute the new term a failed state. Would you say Guyana is a failed state?
Yes.
Give me some examples.
Of?
What constitutes a failed state?
Let me give you the most recent example. When a government has to turn outside the arm of the state in order to deal with crime, then it says that something is wrong with the state. Now, the armed forces, the police, the army, they're the security arm of the state. And one would imagine that the government in office, if there is a crime situation, would turn to the arm of the state to deal with those problems. The government, from all some of the accusations we've been hearing, and even when you listen to the Minister of Home Affairs, there is a sense that the government stepped outside the state in order to deal with the crisis of the society. And so that calls into question the state. Now, the state that we got from independence was an authoritarian state in many regards. I mean, the personnel changed and so forth, but the state, the authoritarian nature of the state remained. That is what Mr. Burnham and the PNC, what they were able to do is to take the colonial state and shape the colonial authoritarian state and shape it in their own image, you see. And the PPP has inherited that same authoritarian state, which Clive Thomas is now arguing a lot of justification, is now become a criminalized state. And when a state reaches that point, it has failed, because a state is supposed to look after the security of the people. A state is supposed to...
Well, the president takes an oath to uphold
the Constitution. Exactly, exactly. And so when we look at the way the Parliament is non-functioning, when we look at the judicial arm of the state, you know, and the confusion there, when we look at the executive arm of the state, as I was saying just now, that seems to be engaging in things outside the ambit of the Constitution, we look at all the arms of the state, and we can see very clearly that they failed to discharge the normal things that the state is expected to discharge in modern society.
On Plain Talk this evening, we'll be discussing with Dr. David Hinds his own assessment of the political conditions in Guyana as he has seen them from his visit over the Christmas holidays. We'll now take another break. We can get her?
I'm glad you touched on that state. You don't look at all the arms of the state. The judicial arm of the state, the legislative arm.
But places like CIA and so on have also gone out of their strictly constitutional mandate to do things well. I don't want to say it publicly,
right, exactly.
But they...
Exactly.
Yeah, we need some, we can get some water, 1-2 glasses of water.
Yeah.
You got to talk about the future, WPA, and your own future in politics. And you know, mine is tied somewhat to yours. That's a pact you and I have, you know, Jam. So I'm going to put some more money in the WPA, though. You can do some fundraising, man.
But I'm going to try to do some fundraising, not like everyone is a local, we're going to do some things.
Yeah.
Try to see if we
Because we need to get activists out there and so on.
Yes.
I can probably, I may even double my subscription for this year, and if we can pay 2 activists. Because I don't like the level at which we're operating. I believe you either do it well or you don't do it at all. I believe you either do it well or don't do it at all. Yeah. Though so we have to hang in there. Everything else since the man's dramatic revelation, real anticlimactic, eh? There's nothing that could match that, in fact, in terms of significance. You see, I think the most they're going to be prepared to offer is Gadraj's head, though. But I don't think he will. Oh, yeah. But I can't see how we could not accept an impartial commission of inquiry.
We talked about that at the same time. Right? And, you know, I'm going to say that all of these cases feared by what is standing now. We can salvage something. We have to be very creative and very committed to it.
I don't know, the more and more. You were very right yesterday in saying that the Indians still feel that this was the way to go.
Yes. I'm not prepared to ignore that.
Yeah. Well, we ignore it at our peril.
I'm not prepared to. I don't think it's the correct position in the long term, but I am not prepared to ignore it because if I were in their position,
Yeah.
I would be right there.
Although, you see, they're not thinking beyond that. I mean, Raj should have said, look, McDonald, you're not doing your blasted job. You either do it or give you 3 months to pull this thing around, or... Welcome back to Plain Talk with Dr. David Hinds, Executive Member for the Working People's Alliance. Before we took a break, Dr. Hinds, you referred to symptoms of this failed state, and you spoke of the current highly public discussion and concern about the role of the government perhaps in solving or attempting to solve crime in a highly unusual manner. What's your view on that?
I think that's the ultimate of the failed state that we were talking about just now. And I think in a sense it's an admission, and I'm assuming that the allegations are true, or they have some grain of truth to them.
Because they still are purely
allegations. Yes, they are, and I'm very mindful of that. But if it is true, and it seems to be quite true, then it's an admission on the part of the PPP to what we have been saying all the time, that it's virtually impossible for the PPP to run this country on its own. I mean, if a government doesn't have the cooperation and support of the armed forces, then you're hamstrung. I mean, one of the primary functions of government is to provide security and protection for the citizens. And you're practically admitting that you can't do that because you can't depend on the armed forces. Therefore, you ought not to be ruling the country, certainly not on your own. Instead of moving towards an accommodation, the PPP decide to rule by other means, it seems, by going outside the ambit of the law. Now, the thing about those revelations that make them very important, because some people are, some Indians are saying, look, this thing was a response to what was happening in Buxton. And so therefore it's a response to what was happening in Buxton. It had to be a positive thing, because if the operation in Buxton was targeting ordinary Indian people and beating them and raping them and what have you, and this thing...
Which is an understandable...
Very understandable. I'm sympathetic. I'm very sympathetic to that view, because I don't know that if I were in the position that I would not have arrived at that view myself.
But does it help us in the long run?
But it doesn't help us in the long run. That is the problem. Although I understand why Indians would adopt that position and sympathize with it, I don't think it helps us in the long run. Because here is the story. If some Indian group had gotten together and say, we are going to retaliate, a group of Indian people, and say we're going to form squads to retaliate with what we see as an attack on Boston, from Buxton. They say tit for tat is not always an answer, but one could understand that. But this is not an Indian group. This is the government of the country. Apparently, if these things are true, using taxpayers' money, using their office to systematically murder people outside the ambit of the law. So if I may venture to say that that kind of murder is a qualitatively different kind of murder from ordinary people in society engaging in conflict and so forth. The state is now entering as a gang, right? But I would venture, if it is true, again, I'd venture to describe this kind of rule as gangsterism, you see. And that is, I would not want to think that Indian people would be comfortable in supporting a kind of gangster kind of governance, because in the end, what it will lead to is retaliation from the other side, and then retaliation leads to counter-retaliation, and we're not going to recover from that. So I do think that the Indian position, while it's understandable, it has to be tempered by an understanding that we cannot continue going down this road forever, and that the government of the day has a responsibility to operate within the ambit of the law and the Constitution. I mean, of course, all citizens have that responsibility, but the government has the responsibility to set the example.
Now, the Minister of Home Affairs, again, purely allegations, has been fingered. He's a key player in all of this. How do we resolve this situation? How do we respond to the concerns of the Indians and the concerns of the opposition, who are in fact saying, look, this is completely unacceptable?
If we are accusing the government of operating outside the ambit of the law, then we have to be very careful that we don't do the same thing, and so therefore operate within the ambit of the law. So the first thing I would say is what everyone is saying: ask Minister Gajraj to resign. Now there is precedence. I mean, during the PNC days, and maybe know the PNC days were the bad days, but Minister Corbyn at that time, there was an allegation against him, and President White asked him to step down from office while an investigation was carried out. Of course, he came back into cabinet at the end of the whatever investigation took place. So there is precedence for that thing, and so therefore I would say the first thing for Minister Gajraj to do is to step down if he doesn't do so willingly, and he should have done so. Then the president should ask him to step down pending an investigation. Now, everyone is calling for an investigation, but we have not, to my mind, certainly at the public level, thought through what kind of investigation we want. Now, I have a problem with the executive branch investigating itself. So if the government solely sets up an investigating body to investigate one of its own, I do not think that that is impartial. I would like to see an investigative body.
It would not be perceived as impartial, for sure.
It certainly would not be perceived, and it would not be impartial in the context of
so
governance.
It would not serve the purpose.
It will not serve. It will not serve the purpose. So I would think that, and I would suggest this very strongly, that the Parliament should set up, and I don't mind if the Parliament, in conjunction with the executive branch, set up an investigating commission, because you see, the Parliament is supposed to be the oversight of the executive branch. So if somebody from the executive branch is fingered there, it seems to me the Parliament should play its role. Some people are suggesting a parliamentary/judiciary commission. I don't know. I think the Parliament is best placed. And that the parties, the parliamentary parties, agree on the composition of this commission. And I would strongly urge that the composition be made up partly of CARICOM nationals and local nationals. I don't like a completely foreign commission, and I also don't like one that is purely internal and so on, given our own contradictions. So I think first it should be, it should come under purview of the Parliament, and that it should be a mixed commission of CARICOM and local. And I think that is the way to go, because it's okay to call for investigation, but if the government is investigating itself, then it defeats the purpose.
But there's an even greater possibility that the government refuses to support any investigation. This whole episode is seen as a watershed. What if the government were to stand firm and say, look, this is what we had to do, we had our constituents that we had to protect, it became necessary to go outside the normal.
I don't want to imagine it, Chris, but the consequences are going to be great. I don't want to imagine it. Because, again, we're dealing in a heightened racial and ethnic situation that we must always bear that in mind. That's what we're dealing with. And African people are being prodded by their organizations, understandably, and I would say even among their ranks on their own, would see this as an affront to them. You see, in the final analysis, what we're talking about is a question of power. Because the argument here, and understandably, is that the minister and the government are using their power to carry out certain things. And so therefore, something has to do about power within the society. And if the government refuses to set up a commission and investigate, then it is very clear that they're not accountable to anybody, and that they're prepared to rule in a cavalier manner. And I think after what we've seen since 1997, and we've survived miraculously, but after what we've seen since 1997, that would be ill-advised. The consequences are going to be great.
What is the role of parties like WPA, GAP, and ROAR in a matter like this?
Well, their role is to do, I think, what I'm attempting to do here, and that is to try to put all the cards on the table and try to point to the dangers that lie ahead if certain course of action, a certain course of action is not taken. The thing with those parties is that in the mix, in the political equation, parties like the WPA and GAP and so on have very little clout, very little influence on the outcome of things, very little influence on people's behavior and so on. But the influence can come in terms of trying to point the two parties in a direction of a solution of the problem in a sane direction, rather than taking the zero-sum position that they've always taken. So the role is to try to, in some way, mediate the situation, but also to try to educate the masses of people, both Indians and Africans, about what is at stake here. To say to Indians that if you support this line of action by the government, it will backfire in the long run. And to say to Africans that if you treat this matter as a purely a racial matter without understanding why Indians have taken the position that they've taken, and if you get very reckless, it will come back to haunt all of us. So that let us give the little that we have left, the little space that we have left for a decent and honorable solution to the problem. Let us give that a chance to work itself out. But of course, that is dependent primarily on what decision the government takes.
What decision the government takes, as well as what decision the opposition...
What decision the opposition takes. But the opposition, I would imagine they would be playing a wait-and-see game.
Responding to the government.
Responding to the government.
Now, from what you've seen over the years, and perhaps most recently, do you see the level of maturity and responsibility being demonstrated by the leadership of both political parties that this current situation demands?
Based on what I've seen in the past, no. I'm not too optimistic at all. But I think that there are moments in history when the social motion drives leaders into certain directions that they may not necessarily want to go on their own. And so I'm putting that burden on the masses of people themselves. It is very difficult in a culture where our people are still leader-oriented. The masses follow the leader. It's a Caribbean phenomenon. It's not just Guyana, it's the rest of the Caribbean. But there are moments when the masses of people have taken their destiny into their own hands and have acted very responsibly in terms of pushing the leaders in a certain direction.
But wouldn't it be better for the leaders to start acting in a mature fashion and in a responsible manner?
Yes, one would hope
Rather than
rely, one would hope that they take that leap. But you see, the nature of political parties in the Caribbean is one that does not allow them to think about the greater good. Political parties have developed in the region in a very narrow way. Their sense of nationalism is minuscule. It is always what benefits the party force. And if the consequences happen to aid the project of national unity, then so be it. And in Guyana, party means race, and race means party, and that's what makes it ominous. But I think on their own, they're not going to move there.
The two leaders.
The two leaders, and you know, we don't have strong civil society in Guyana. If civil society means that space where people organize and mobilize outside of party and government, then we don't have that because of the racial situation. Our civil society, or what should be civil society organizations, are in one way or the other tied with one of the political parties or political tribes.
It is still very much a localized and national issue. But Guyana, of course, is a signatory to the Charter of Civil Liberties of CARICOM. It's part of the OAS. It's part of America's sphere of influence. Mm-hmm. America already has problems with Venezuela, has problems with Cuba. Do you see America being concerned about what is happening here now?
I'm sure America will be concerned about what is happening in the country. And I want to take it broader than the United States of America. I take your point that part of the strategy in terms of pushing our leaders in a certain direction is not just the masses of people here, but an internationalization of this problem. Because what is happening, if we believe what we are hearing, is something that the rest of the civilized world is turning its face against. And the criminalization of state in Guyana will obviously have effects for CARICOM, single market and economy, Caribbean Court of Justice. We are becoming a family, a closer family. And when one member of the family is behaving in such an errant manner, it must have repercussions for what's happening. So this is a CARICOM problem. This is a hemispheric problem. We're talking about the free trade area of the Americas. And so therefore, I would urge, and I think that, and I know that the WPA is beginning to take steps in this direction, to, in a sense, internationalize what is happening, or what has been happening, and what is coming to light here right now. And I think that would be a second strategy to take in terms of driving our political leaders to come to a solution. Because you see, Chris, and I keep going back to it, Phantom Squad, Buxton, 28 years of rule, the racial violence in the 60s, all of those events and phenomena, all of them point to the larger question, which is the question of the racial distribution of power in Guyana. And every time we reach the crisis point and we don't seize the opportunity to deal with that problem, we are creating the conditions for a new problem. That's my point. And once again, in a funny kind of way, this situation has presented Guyana once again with an opportunity to deal with this question of power.
An opportunity and a challenge.
And a challenge, yes.
Now, if we can turn back in at least for some of the time left, the Working People's Alliance. Is there a future for the Working People's Alliance, and what is that future? And who is that future?
That's a difficult one. In the mix of things, as I said before, parties like the Working People's Alliance really have very little space to do very much in terms of affecting the hardcore politics. But I do think the WPA has the moral authority, it has the capacity, and it has a history with it to do a certain kind of work that needs to be done in the society. There is no vigorous conversation about real issues in the society. We skirt around issues, we react to situations, but we don't really, we're not engaged in an ongoing discussion. None of the organizations, none of the political parties. And I think the Working People's Alliance is best placed to deal with that kind of massive public education and public sensitization that is needed. And so I think there is a role for the WPA in the sense that Walter Rodney, and I'm arguing very strongly here, that the only period in our modern history that we've really had class alliance and class solidarity. Yes, was in the Rodney days. And Dr. Premis here has taken me to task with it. But I remain adamant that there are classes in Guyana. Huh? There's a working class. There is that working class. It has been there and it will always be there. But there is no class consciousness. The sugar worker is not conscious of himself as being in the same kind of boat with the bauxite worker. They're divided based. They respond to race. There is racial consciousness, all right? But no class consciousness. But there are classes. And so therefore, I think that it is a task of the WPA and so on to begin to raise those issues. The issue of class. The issue of class and the issue of inequality. The issue of empowerment of people. Because you see, power sharing, for example, is popularly seen as an accommodation between the two parties. The Hines formula for power sharing goes broader than that. It's about separation of powers. It's about what I call vertical power sharing. That is power sharing between people in their local organs, in their communities, sharing the power with those at the top, right? So power sharing, for me, is about giving the nation a chance to breathe and to get off this racial thing that we're on. But more fundamentally, is a chance to truly democratize our society, a chance to truly bring ordinary people into the whole question of governance. And so I'm talking not just about horizontal power sharing between two parties at the top, but also the people at the bottom, serving as a kind of counter to that accommodation at the top. Because that accommodation at the top could itself emerge into a dictatorship of the two. So that my concept of power sharing, which I have not really had a chance to really talk about, goes beyond the accommodation between the two parties.
Now, one of the, again, perhaps lesser known realities is that the 2001 elections were a single election. It was a single model. It was, in other words, we are supposed to work towards the electoral system for 2006.
Yes.
Is anything being done on that?
So far as I understand, nothing is being done in that regard. It seems to me that neither of the major players is concerned about dealing with those issues, and they will probably argue that we have more pressing issues, the kind of murders that have been taking place here. But it is an issue that has to be dealt with. I think, once again, we do not have a constant conversation in this society. We do not have a constant conversation in the society about these issues. What do we want? What kind of electoral system we want?
What kind of elections commission we want?
What kinds of elections commission we want? We had a recent thing of the government saying to the elections commission, but you're not independent. But if in post-Burnham, we're hearing that the elections commission is not independent, then what have we struggled for? You see? Now, in terms of the electoral system, I would like to see a mixed electoral system, the first past the post, mixed with the...
There was some of that.
There was some of that, but it was not proportional. You see, I would like to see the country being divided into equal districts based on population size.
It's purely convenience to use it.
For the region and so on. And I think that defeated the purpose of proportionality.
But given the tremendous distrust which exists, particularly between the two political parties, given that no work has yet been done, no thought given to that, can we have elections as usual in 2006?
I don't think that we can have elections in 2006, and I will be glad if we don't have elections in 2006. Because I think elections have been destructive to the process of nation building in this country.
But surely elections, however, are a way for the parties to put themselves to the electorate and say, look, judge me and choose.
Yes, and so therefore I am not against elections. I'm just saying 2006, it seems to me that what we have to do to ensure that we have credible elections, to ensure that we have elections that will not, the outcome will not be a win-lose, but a win-win outcome, that we have to do a lot of work. And the time between now and 2006 to put all of that in place is not enough. And so therefore, I would not mind elections not being in 2006. I would like to see elections where we have real elections, where parties can really go out there and say, judge me based on my policies.
But elections are constitutionally due in 2006. You're saying you hope we don't have elections in 2006. What are you hoping that we should have then?
I'm hoping that by 2000, that we spend the time now, the next 3 or 4 years, dealing with the constitutional reform, finishing that process, putting in place a proper elections commission, do registration all over again, because everything that I've heard about the database and all that is happening there, that is in pure shambles. That I would prefer no election
so
in...
So GCOM will challenge that? No.
Well, I know they will challenge that. I would prefer no election in 2006 than for us to have elections like the ones we had in 1997 and 2001.
But they were declared by independent monitoring groups.
Yes,
as free and fair.
but they were both followed by mayhem. you see?
So
and it is the outcome of the election that I'm concerned about.
The popular reaction. But how do you deal with that?
Well, like I said, Chris, we have to ask ourselves, what do we want? Do we want electioneering, or do we want social peace in the country? Which one is more important? And I'm saying social peace, the striving for social peace, should precede elections. The elections will make more sense. Elections will be more meaningful if there is social peace. Elections, within the context of social turmoil, defeats the democratic purpose. So I'm not anti-election. All I'm saying is what we've been saying since 1997, because the WPA warned against rushing in 1997, and we rushed into the 1997, and we're still feeling the consequence of that.
Dr. David, I want to thank you very much for sharing your time with me and Blaine Talk. I know you leave tomorrow, have a good flight. I hope it doesn't take 15, 16 months before we see you back again.
I hope so myself. Thank you very much, Chris.
Good night.